Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Wednesday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up on Patreon, Justin Sizon has a DualShock 3 controller that they've just about given up on. They've taken it apart to clean it and repair it, and now they have to press really hard on the home button to get it to work at all. They've even tried using zip ties to get the two halves of the controller to fit tighter, but there's no difference. Does anybody have any idea how to fix it? So I'm not an expert in those, but I would have some tips that maybe you've already tried, but I'm going to share them anyway. First and foremost is make sure that everything's fitting together exactly the way that it should. With the more modern controllers from 2000s on, there's a lot more parts in them, and it is very easy to not get everything set perfectly so that you don't have a tight fit. That might be a little obvious, but I've personally made that mistake a whole bunch of times. Or I've done the way more common thing is where I get it all back together and find that there's one piece still sitting on my desk. So then I have to disassemble the entire thing and go find where that one piece went. The other thing too is the home button itself. Check maybe some deoxit on the physical button, and for any pads. So if you had said like a start button, so just the rubber membranes, I would check to make sure those weren't worn out and try to get some kind of controller refurbishing kit that includes those, because that's something that's definitely happened to me before. Is the buttons that you don't use as often, start and select, wear out faster because they don't have as much protection around them and not as much of the same material. So sometimes those end up going first as a result. So getting one of those repair kits might help. And also in that case, even if your repair kit is lesser than good quality, new is definitely better than not. And since it's only start and select type of thing, it's not as crucial as getting really good buttons and a D-pad membrane. But for the home button, I'm not really sure. So I just wanted to share some very basic tips based on all of the mistakes I've made. But if anybody wants to comment specifically in the comments about, what exactly could be done in this case, or if a faulty home button is even a known issue. Next up, Steven Sanders just wanted to clarify that the Akura VGA to HDMI box for the Dreamcast from the Behar brothers is simply a converter, converting the analog to digital signal. And it's essentially the same image they're getting if they used a VGA cable into a VGA port. It's just being supplied by HDMI. Yes, however, there's some stuff that goes along with this. And I have to start out by saying, I've been supporting the Behar brothers for 10 years plus now. I've tried to review every product they've had. I've always tried to provide feedback and do my absolute hardest to try to help them out. But the quality of their products has really gone downhill. And I tiptoed around it for a long time. I tried to be super polite. I tried to give them feedback. I helped them, and a lot of my friends as well helped them improve a lot of their products. But they kept sending me stuff after it was already released to the public. So I guess they got really upset when I called out things like I'm about to warn you about, because they'd already made the product. They should have sent it to me first so I could catch all this stuff for them. But the problem is their new pigtails, the ones that I've personally tested, weren't shielded properly. So you get a ton of interference using that box. Also, it's $70. And if you're just looking for a 480p HDMI output from your Dreamcast, some of those cheaper cables are fine. None of them are going to look as good as a digital to digital mod, but at the very least, some of the cheaper HDMI cables would be okay, or even some of the somewhat decent you could find VGA cables that are there. The problem is, even the VGA cables themselves, you could use a VGA to HDMI converter and that cable for cheaper than the Akura box, except it's hard to determine which ones are crap. One of the hardest things about this is there's probably only two companies that make Dreamcast VGA cables, and then they just white box resell them to other companies who put their logos on them. Some of them have fancy boxes and packaging and a high price premium to make you think you're getting a different cable, but it's the same thing. So if you wanted a cheap way to try this out, a decent VGA to HDMI converter was probably something, if you're a tinkerer, you should have in your toolbox anyway, and they're like 20 bucks. And if you're going 480p and up, that should be, or you shouldn't have any compatibility issues. So I would just get a cheap VGA cable and one of those and give it a try and see. If you really liked something that the Akura had to offer, try it, but buy it from a store that'll let you return it, because the last couple of products that I tested from them were definitely not they underperformed drastically. And it's not something that you need a scope to see. I mean, if you got a cheap VGA cable, that assuming you find one that's shielded and not made like crap, and you put that into a standard analog to digital converter, you play that on your monitor for a minute. You just load up the Dreamcast logo, load up your game. You'll know immediately if one of them is shielded and one of them isn't, because you're going to get diagonal interference across the screen. White backgrounds will really show off some of the bad stuff. So I hope that they improved all of this. Maybe they fixed their pigtails. Maybe they improved their products. I really hope so. I doubt they're ever going to talk to me again, because I'm just always honest. It's always funny because when I was praising their products, they loved me, but I was still just honest always. So if you're going to buy that at your own risk. I wouldn't, because of all of the products I've seen in the past couple of years, but feel free to give it a try as long as you're able to return it if it doesn't perform well. So last week, one of the questions was talking about replacing a Sony 1645 encoder with a 2075, a newer encoder, on something like a Sega Genesis to try to improve video quality to see if that would do anything. And a couple of people responded, so I wanted to read their responses as well. First, Finney said it's not a drop-in replacement. You actually have to modify the composite video output circuit slightly. I think the original question was wording from an RGB point of view, but I was curious from a composite point of view, so I appreciate that, Finney. This is only shown in an example circuit diagram in the data sheet, and only in some versions of the data sheet, and the rest of the data sheet doesn't really explain it. They've tried using the same circuit as the 1645, and they get a very overbright kind of blurry signal. They've also never been able to get a noticeably better signal compared to the 1645 on a Genesis, and they think part of this is their sync and subcarrier signals are just too out of spec, and no encoder really likes them. Note how the Saturn and PlayStation also use the 1645, and their composite is so much sharper than any Genesis they've seen. That's also board routing, the RAM that they use. There's a lot of things that really that are involved in that, but I'm just going to keep going. But it is possible to put it in a Genesis, and it does work. It's just not much better than the 1645. Also, bear in mind, if you're encoder swapping on certain Genesis revisions that depend on the 2-volt VREF from the video encoder, then the 1645 has 4 volts instead, and the 2075 has none at all. So you have to work around that by creating that VREF some other way. Also, JFT said back in the day, they put a 2075 into a Model 2 Genesis, and it did seem to work. So they're going to try to dig that console out of the pile of systems they have in their basement and test it out again to see. So generally speaking, I think my guess from last week stays clear in that I wouldn't do that unless you're experimenting like we all love to do sometimes. But from hey, I want to try to get better quality out of my Genesis, I really think you should either embrace it as is, and if you have a Model 1, do that subcarrier bypass that keeps composite but still enables better RGB. I think that's my favorite mod for the Model 1 because it's not so much a mod as a fix. I'll leave that up to you. That's all opinion. But or if you just really want to try to squeeze the best analog video, you could use a triple bypass. And Zaxor has new versions of the triple bypass out that have some new features and stuff like that. So those are my 2 recommendations. But you're absolutely welcome to try anything you want. And shout out to all the tinkerers out there, because it's because of people like you that we get to have these conversations and learn these answers. So thank you. Next, Dustin Madison wanted to follow up on my deodorant comment from last week and said there's actually an anime con over in Kentucky going on right now, and their friends who are doing a comedy show there says there's huge signs everywhere telling the patrons to both shower and use deodorant. That is ridiculous. I don't know. I don't think of myself as a very sophisticated person. I don't like to dress up unless I have to, unless it's the respectful thing to do, but I've just never stunk. Within reason, of course, after mowing the lawn, after getting out of the gym, but just like showing up in public to hang out, I don't know. It just baffles me that people think it's okay to reek, but whatever. I won't get into that rant again, but that was a funny follow-up. Next up, Mecha Crisis wants to know if I've ever tried SCART cables from Gaming Fun 80 Point. 80PT. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but they want to know if I've tried them and what my thoughts were on them. I've never heard of them until you mentioned it. However, my thoughts on SCART cables are all the same. Are they shielded? At the very least, are the RGB and audio lines shielded? Are the connectors correct? Are they snug? Are they death grip? Or are they loose and falling out? And it's very easy for anybody to test this stuff themselves. If you have something like, as long as you have a good quality SCART switch and a good quality SCART cable. And all of my test methods can be done with just that basic setup. So let's say, for example, you have a G-SCART switch or the GameCare switch, or even that push button from Retro Gaming Cables, that basic one. So take whatever you have and plug it directly in from your console to the target. Maybe it's a scaler, whatever it might be. If you do this digitally, it would actually be a bit easier than on a CRT, but same principle. Fire up something like Super Mario World, the first level that's all blue, and also any Konami game with that all white background. Plug it in directly and check out how the blue background looks. Should be clear. There should be no diagonal interference or checkerboarding, I guess, unless you're using a 2-chip SNES, in which case you have to do this with a different console, an unmodded 2-chip. And then also fire up that screen and see how much analog noise, how much buzz and hum you get in the all-white Konami screen. Then plug that into this the switch, a good known quality switch, and then take this SCART cable and use that on the output side to your scaler or whatever setup, and just do the same thing. Is the sky in Super Mario World, does that have any kind of interference in it? Is there any kind of diagonal stuff on it that wasn't there before? And same thing with the Konami logo. Is there more buzz, or is there less buzz, or is it the exact same? It shouldn't be less, to be honest with you. So those are the basics. It would help if you had a sync-on composite video cable, because that would generate a lot of interference that this cable could then bleed through. But that's basically it. And when you're talking about SCART to SCART cables, there's no components in there. So you don't have to worry about safety issues. You just have to worry about shielding. And that's also why I'm totally okay with stuff like the Cable Direct brand, because while each signal has its own ground, it's not shielded. It's just a thick cable with a bunch of conductors in it. So they're not bad, but they're also not what I would recommend if you have a quality setup, but they're cheap. So buying one of those to hold you off, knowing that you're going to get some interference, or just saying, hey, I need a spare SCART cable for when I need to test stuff, those are absolutely awesome. So I would just put all that stuff through their paces. If anybody's taking the time to hand make shielded SCART cables, they should take the time to do this as well. And they should also encourage you to test, because like I always say, any developer that works really hard to make a quality product wants you to test it. They want you to show people, hey, this thing's quality. Look what I put it through and it's still working great. So don't feel bad doing that. Be happy, especially if it's positive results. Make sure to share that, because we live in a world, unfortunately, where negative news spreads like wildfire and positive news gets forgotten. So just always throw people a thumbs up like that if you put it through its paces and realize, hey, wow, this is a really well shielded cable. You could also pop the SCART heads off, but the way some cables are made, it's hard to get them back on. You could damage it. That's always a last resort for me. It used to be the first thing I did, but seeing how some quality manufacturers make their SCART heads, I like to leave them alone unless you really have to. But so my short answer is I got no clue, but that longer answer hopefully would teach you or whoever else who's bought one how to just double check who's bought any SCART cable, how to double check to make sure it's good. Next up, Captain Retro is looking to get the best video and audio output they can from their GameCube that does have a digital output. Their current setup is using the Retrobit Prism cables through an Extron crosspoint switch into a RetroTink 4K via an HT15 cable. They know there are some issues with the Prism cable, but they don't want to spend $300 for the OEM component video cable. So I think in this scenario, a better choice might be something like getting just a Carby with the HDMI output and using your own HDMI to component video converter. Now, those are getting harder and harder to find, especially if you want something compatible with 480i and 240p. However, if you're somebody that predominantly uses your GameCube in 480p mode, like almost always, I'm definitely one of those people, especially going through like a RetroTink 4K, then you should be able to get any cheap DAC. So at retrorgb.link/cheap DAC, even the ones there that have not been consistent and have not been great for 15 kilohertz, generally all work perfectly with 480p. Now, you might run into stuff where the color conversion isn't quite perfect, all the DAC stuff with Kuro that we talked about. You could start spending money on higher quality conversions, but then you're already at the price point of the official GameCube component cable. So my advice to you is first, just take a step back. Even though the Prism cables weren't the best because they're really just rebranded stuff, is it doing something that's hurting your setup? Are you seeing something in your setup that's just not working for you? If the answer is yes, then consider picking up a Carby and a cheap DAC and just wiring it up that way. However, if you're just reading the reviews, reading in-depth articles by people like Extrems, who is a total expert on this stuff, and you're seeing them say, hey, they're not as good, but you're not quite seeing the negative effects, I personally would leave well enough alone. Everybody's eyes are different, everybody's setup's different, and there's going to be people who see things more than others. My eyes were always more towards sharpness, so I could see things like interference and all those link shots with the sharpness on its face. I could see that way easier than colors. So everybody's going to see different things. You could, of course, go with a Pluto mod or something like that. But whenever there's a console that has a plug and play option, I would always recommend that first, just because what if something goes wrong with your GameCube? What if you trip and fall while carrying it and your knee goes through it? If you got a plug and play option, you pull that out, you strip the GameCube for all its parts that are still not, still working and not broken. You get a new GameCube and now you have a bin of spare parts and you just move that over. Whereas if you trip and fall and you put your knee through the Pluto mod, that's a lot more money that you have just lost. I guess you could say the same thing if you trip and fall on the Carby too. I'm just saying it's one stupid scenario of many that might make it easier to just continue with plug and play stuff. So that's just my suggestion. Make sure that what you're seeing is actually a problem and something that bothers you. And if it is, maybe try going down that route and see what happens. One more from Captain Retro. They just picked up a Siglent 2-channel 200 megahertz oscilloscope so they could start learning, but they're kind of a noob with it and they're wondering if there's some good reference signals to choose from. Yeah, absolutely. So the one that I would start with is obviously an all-white screen, just so you can get the square waves up for red, green, and blue signals. Then you're going to want to check out HD. If you have a Genesis and Super Nintendo, check out HD Retrovision's test software and get the 100% color bars. Now, I believe these are available in the 240p test suite, but laziness. You just fire up the HD Retrovision ROM and poof, it appears. You just don't even need a controller after you've launched it. So that's why I recommend that one, because you don't have to go through menus. You don't have to worry about hitting anything. Just fire that up, and then you can see the shape of the different colors on there. And then you could try going through different patterns after that. But those are by far the ones that I think you should start with in the context of retro gaming and analog video signals. And also just check out those same patterns with like composite video and S video, and you could actually see how they look on the scope. I would also go back, and while we use Rigel scopes, I would check out that first video I did with Steve from HD Retrovision. And since you've already kind of been messing around with it, I think you probably have an advantage because some of the things that we talk about might be familiar. So when I did that video with Steve, I had only used a scope a handful of times in my life, and it was really only under the direction of somebody that knew what they were doing. So that was one of my first times actually sitting down and really grasping it. And I'll be honest, most of the time I had no idea what he was talking about. And I went back and rewatched that video a while later. And after I'd been using a scope for a while, I think it was when I rewatched it after I accidentally made a change on my scope and I needed to factory reset it. And then I'm like, well, how did I even get back to this place that Steve set it to? I rewatched that video and then it all clicked like, oh, I totally get it now. Falling edge. Wait, all right, he already explained that, but now I get it because I've been using it. Everybody learns different. I learned backwards, so whatever. But I just think that that'll be probably an advantage for you since you've been messing with it. So I'll leave a link to the oscilloscope section. That, first video with Steve that we did is probably the one that you're going to want to check out. And good luck with it. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but it makes testing so much more cut and dry. And especially if you have like a super gun and arcade boards, you just don't really have to worry about stuff like that. As long as you get used to testing it and you get your workflow so it's pretty easy, you could just throw that sucker on or just even throw your probe on and check out what voltages are coming out and make sure everything's always safe. Next up, Tony Escobar has a BNC cable for a Sega Saturn and wants some clarification on it. So just to back up for a moment, this is essentially an RGB SCART cable, but instead of a SCART head on the end, it's BNC cables so that you could use it directly into an Extron crosspoint. And right on the Retro Gaming Cables website, Rob states that it won't work with crosspoints because it's sync on Luma, and crosspoints require pure C-Sync. So I understand both sides of it. I actually do think that was a mistake on his end. We're all human. I'm not throwing shade. It is what it is. But I would assume that the reason you would use Luma in a situation like that is because it's very hard to add components into BNC cables, but you would need those components on the C-Sync line going into a crosspoint in most scenarios. Even if you could skip the resistor, you probably might still need the cap or something. Whereas Luma, you just wire up the signal. So you just have this shielded line going to it with no components in between. The problem, and here's where I think this might be a mistake, is the number one use case for BNC cables in retro gaming is Extron crosspoints. So they're essentially useless to people with crosspoints and original Sega Saturns. Except, what are you trying to wire up? Are you trying to wire up an original Sega Saturn, or are you trying to wire up one of those new Mr. cases with a Saturn DIN? I will double and triple check this for you on an upcoming live stream, but I could swear my Retro Castle case with the Saturn DIN outputs C-Sync on the Luma pin when it's in RGB mode, not any of the other modes. And I'm pretty sure it definitely outputs over the Luma pin, even in RGB mode, because the only cable I have left here is a Sync on Luma cable, except I'm not sure if there's anything else on that line. So if you have a Retro Castle case, that should work through a crosspoint. I haven't tested the Mr. Add-ons one yet. That'll hopefully be soon enough. My friend still has to send it over to me, so I will obviously check that as well in the stream. And I actually don't even have a Saturn C-Sync cable anymore, so if that's the case, then I'm not even going to be able to do the stream. So hopefully you could still get the signals out of those pins. The only other advice I could give for something like that is you could get a C-Sync SCART cable and then just get a SCART to BNC adapter, which, that kind of sucks because you have to buy all this extra stuff. But if you really wanted to go all out, you could even get one of those Kaitor Industries SCART braces so that you could lock the SCART to BNC and SCART cable together so they won't pop out. So that might at least be sort of a help for you. And I believe some people make those SCART to BNC adapters with the Phoenix connector, so you could go directly into a crosspoint. So it's not the end of the world. Worst case scenario, save that BNC cable for a Mr. case, assuming this will work. I'll check. Hopefully this week I'll be able to do that live stream. And that's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to do the Q&As today. So if they come in, I would have time to do that live stream this week. So definitely give that a try. The only other thing, if that doesn't work and you're looking for it on a Mr., is you could try to find those RCA cables, but you can't really find those anymore. There was, I believe, 2 manufacturers making them because there were 2 molds. So it could be the same manufacturer that changed the mold, but I think it's more likely that one manufacturer made them fine, and then another Bitfunks cloner, it might have actually been Bitfunks, came in, did a cheaper version. So seller number 1 just said, I'm not making these anymore. They're undercutting me. And then that ran out of stock. And then the cheap, crappy ones ran out of stock. So they're just not out there anymore. But those would sync on composite video. So that's still not going to work with a crosspoint, except it might work in the Mr. scenario if Luma doesn't, but you can't really get those anymore. I just wanted to address that because there's one of my fellow nerds listening and go, what about those RCA cables you reviewed? You said those weren't too bad. What if it? So I just wanted to address that in advance because that's certainly what I would be thinking if I was listening to this. So those aren't going to work for a Saturn, and they probably aren't going to work, or they probably would work for a Mr., assuming that you can get clean C-Sync out of those pins when in RGB mode. So you're not completely SOL. You just might have to spend money on stuff that you might not have needed. But links to all of those cables are on RetroRGB.com. Obviously, go to the Saturn page for Saturn cables. The SCART to BNC links are on that as well. And I definitely reviewed the Kaitor ones. I'll leave a link to the Kaitor stuff because it's super easy to go to RetroRGB in the Saturn section, just /Saturn.html. But I've got to find that exact Kaitor brace for you just in case you go down that road, and hopefully that'll help. Well, that's it for this week. As always, any questions you have, feel free to ask whatever you'd like. Just please put them in the latest Q&A post wherever it is that you support. Very often in days like today, the questions only come in on Patreon because that's where most of the supporters are. But anybody who supports on any platform, do so. Just try to put the question in the latest post because I often can't figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, I like to just scroll through like we're hanging out and, answer like we're just chilling somewhere together, making it nice and laid back. So, as always, thank you so much for your support. I always look forward to doing these, and I will see you next week.